So these are drawings from the 1980s. In the 1980s, I was a teacher at the AA, and these are conceptual pieces. They were never intended to be blueprints for buildings. They are statements about cultural discourse. About this one, which you're seeing now, is a bridge in Venice. It was a competition judged by Aldo Rossi for the Accademia Bridge in Venice. Obviously, an incredible subject for an architect to work on in such a special place. What we're seeing here is an attempt to do a contemporary language in a historic situation. The situation is the Accademia on one side of the Canale Grande, and some of the small pictures down here are Canaletto paintings, so copied in a mechanical way on a copy machine and painted into. Basically, the drawing technique is the subject. Some are line drawings, and some are these references to historic readings of Venice, like these ones here, different temporary pavilions in Venice. And there are ones down here. It's the structural system of the bridge we proposed, which was quite a radical structural system. And here on the side is a model we made at the time from 1986. Slightly worse for wear. We see the broken tension cable, which means the structural system no longer makes sense. This is the sort of work that was avant-garde in the 1980s. And there's one more piece like that next to it. You see the trees are made from Brillo pads. Not just the composition of the architecture, but the method of presenting it was something we were always trying to reinvent. These ones are a similar project I did in the 1980s. We published at the AA a book called Bridge, Buildings and Picture. This is a bridge in Paris, the Pont des Arts, the first ever steel bridge in France. At that moment, there were two arches missing, so we designed reconnections to the banks. On the banks of the Seine, there are little boxes where they sell postcards. On each side, we have postcard museums. But here I'm using a functional program to justify it. I think this scheme is more to be understood as a radical composition, or as a radical way of experiencing architecture. It's to do with crossing a river, with going up into a building with one function and across a temporary or provisional connection, then being on a platform in the middle of the river, hovering. My whole reading at the time of bridges was that they were not about getting to the other side, that the spatial experience of being suspended above the water was the whole point of a bridge. You see, these drawings are much more sketchy than the Venice drawings. This was a time when we were trying to break out of the rigidity of orthogonal projection. But even these drawings, you see very, very specific plans, little square plan, and a strange relationship of the building itself and a screen in front, which is like a mask. We considered our architecture at the time to be figurative. So if it's figurative, it has a face, it has a character. And if it has a face, it can wear a mask. It can pretend to be something else other than what it really is. So that's the sort of discourse that was around in the 1980s, where we were all happily producing drawings. No idea that a new technology was about to appear to make all of that redundant, and that's all old hat now. That's sort of 40 years ago. When computers started appearing in architectural offices, we all stopped drawing by hand. This set of drawings here, we consider the last presentation that we did in our office, the architecture bureau of Bolles+Wilson, the last hand-drawn presentation. These were planning studies for the city of Rotterdam, and we were working together with the planning office of Rotterdam, the DS+V. I'm not sure what that stands for in Dutch. It was to do with the landing of a bridge, which was then under construction by UN Studios, and the quay next to the bridge, which we designed and built. So this, and here we moved on from the conceptual works of the 1980s to 1990s, mid-1990s. Bolles and Wilson have moved on to having commissioned in major public spaces like this one. Here the question was, how should this bridge, or what should be the composition of spaces where this bridge lands? There's one zone of government offices here, new offices here. This is where Rem Koolhaas has built his enormous tower in Rotterdam now. But what we identified with these drawings was that we have a hinge situation here. This building is a sort of hinge where the two districts come together. This study then went into the official master plan of the city. And then they chose this site, an incredibly prominent site between the Maas River and the Rheinhaven here, as the site for a new theatre. And then it was a competition for the theatre, the Luxor Theatre, so vaudeville theatre for people who work in the docks of Rotterdam. Because we'd done the master plan, we were the only non-Dutch architects in this competition. It was made, the competition was Herman Herzberger, Rem Koolhaas, Kees Christiansen, lots of very prominent Dutch architects. We, as the foreigners, won it. One of the drawings, that one, is the Luxor Theatre. We did that after the competition, put the Luxor Theatre back in. We used our endless facade concept from the planning studies for the actual theatre. It's now built. It has 1,500 seats, full house almost every night. This graphic technique is also highly inventive. We use stick-on foil on top of printed line drawings. Basically, the whole time here, we are inventing the language to present architecture along with the architecture. Rem Koolhaas was very upset he didn't win it. It was his city and he thought it should have been his building. There was a little tower of numbers here, LED signs of time, weather, one with the world population burning rapidly at one end. That for a long time stood there as the symbol of the new life of the new docklands. 2-3 years ago, they threw it away because the docklands are now functioning and they don't need a symbol of what's coming. But the LED boxes inside that little tower had already died, and they were digital, and they suffered a digital Alzheimer's, and they basically one after the other died. So the cigarettes stopped burning, time stopped, and the 01 digital icon also died. So basically, I like the narrative which goes with this drawing of what happened in an actual city, in an actual place. So this was called the Tower of Moving Numbers, and here's a square of fixed numbers. These are numbers, piers in Rotterdam, when they're taken out of service, they lose their number. This is a garden of lost numbers. And I no longer know the number sequence, but there was a 1 and a 2 and a 4. Embossed those in the paving of the square in stainless steel, very big. There's also a giant figure in stainless steel set into the paving called Rotterdam Man. Maybe something for archaeologists of the future. On this wall, they were meant to be transitional drawings. Maybe you can duck around the corner and see them on the next wall. But here's a hand drawing of our waterfront quay in Rotterdam, which we built, one of our first projects in the Netherlands. Around the corner, we have more recent projects from Bolles+Wilson. This one, a visitors center high in the Andes, a place called Moray. These are hand drawings of mine scanned in and reworked digitally. It's a sort of hybrid drawing. You know? Those are the transitions between hand drawings from the 1970s, 1980s, and the way architectural offices work these days. And this is a fantastic site. They invited a number of prominent officers, us, Grafton Architects, Sana, and a few others to do a visitor center there. This is another competition, visitor center for an archaeological site in Germany, presented with the digital drawings on a photograph and my hand sketches next to it. I've put these in the exhibition because they're hybrid drawings. They're mixed between hand drawing and digital. Now we go on to the next wall. Oh, this one.
Yes.
This is a screen print we did. I think it was 1993 or 94. We had at that time moved our office from London to Germany and moved from being conceptual architects to building architects. This screen print shows all the projects we have there to date built. An office building in Münster, a digital rock, one of my first and last digital drawings done with a children's paint program. A little house in Tokyo which we built, the quay in Rotterdam, the city library in Münster, our first major public commission, a technology center in Münster in Germany, kindergarten in Frankfurt, another church building in Münster, and a little folly building in Osaka, and another digital rock drawing. This is a screen print we did with very good screen printers, and the same printers now work for Richters in Germany. Okay, we go to the next wall now. In contrast to those drawings from the 1970s and 1980s, I'm showing here recent objects which I make myself. I don't call them drawings because they're on wood. They have a thickness. If you look closely at one of these from the side, they're on MDF. Basically relieved of the obligation of having to produce drawings for a professional architectural office. And I'm free to engage my imagination with architectural compositions, drawings which are also objects like buildings. And each of these has a title which is a very important part of the work. Like this one, which is called The Man Who Sacrificed His Left Arm to Parametrics. Again, the digital theme. Or where is it?
Which one?
That's the parametrics.
Yes.
This is about Malevich. Lots of them have the theme of Malevich, re-investigating Malevich. This is called Malevich Like Sushi. And this is a painting, and these are all miniature paintings as well. I paint very, very small. The miniature painting of the first ever constructivist exhibition in Moscow. This one is called a self-portrait using Alexander Curzon's method. Alexander Curzon was the drawing master at Eton, the father of John Robert Curzon, a very important English watercolorist in the 18th century. His method was to do blobs of ink on a canvas and then interpret them as a picture. Here, a painting of Mondrian's studio, or reconstruction of Mondrian's studio. Basically, this is my encyclopedia of references. Here are some plans of the mill owner's building in Ahmedabad, rotated on a colored field. It's called Roll Over John Heddick. As we all know, John Heddick worked with rotating Le Corbusier plans. There's one here where the figure has fallen off. It's called Jackson P. and Mark T. Go Landau. That's Jackson Pollock and Mark Toby. But Jackson Pollock has fallen off. Only Mark Toby left. But
That's Mark Toby. If everyone can see.
But each of these pictures has a sort of built-in narrative. How are we going? We'll be going forever.
Yeah, let's go like a constellation.
This is one from an exhibition at the AA some 4 years ago.
This is very detailed, by the way. So
it's very, very small. They're repainting of pictures of Rome in the 18th century from the baths of the Caracalla. People in the bottom are grand tourists. I did an exhibition at the AA called Some Reasons for Traveling to Italy, which is also about the Grand Tour, the myths of the Grand Tour, which maybe we should move on down to this one, which is called something about Italian light. And my copy of an Italian painting of chiaroscuro, the light of the Italian sunset. Then Schinkel's pavilions in Potsdam, the gardener's house and the pheasantry. These are Italianate buildings in Northern Europe, where the Italianate style has been moved to a climate where you don't get the strong Italian Sheppard. And the last picture is the house of Alison and Peter Smithson, also in Italianate style, Cato Lodge in South Kensington. And each of these pictures has a very complex narrative or story that one can tell, but because they're so small, they're intended that the viewer goes deeply into them and figures out their own interpretation or their own narrative. Some of them, like this one, are more abstract. This is called GPS House. These are pieces of computer paraphernalia stuck onto this very strange shining panel. A lot of these are about the actual texture or the haptic reading of the surface. This one is very shiny, this one is very matte.
Gallery favorite.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Gallery favorite?
It's the gallery datum.
Okay. Okay. Well, this one is called Psychological Disturbances of the Neanderthaler. This one. And the titles are absolutely illogical, and they're meant to be some questions for the viewer. Like this one, which has a very long title, a quote from James Joyce. The title is, you can hardly read it. Then there was the drowning of the Pharaoh and his pedestrians, and they were completely drowned into the sea, the Red Sea. If I was to be honest and say, how did these come about, it's because we live in a quite boring city and the nights are long and I have a lot of time to contemplate such works. In this corner, there are more of the Italian works from the Reasons for Traveling to Italy exhibition. This one is a very small miniature where the images are even smaller than postage stamps. It's an interpretation of a painting by Giovanni Paolo Panini. The painting is in the gallery in Stuttgart. It's of a huge room full of grand tourists and paintings of the ruins of Rome. And how grand my tour, but the picture is obviously very, very small. But and if you're looking closely, you can recognize the Parthenon, Pantheon, etc. The next is from a German painter Hackett, who was the court painter in Naples. William Hamilton, the English ambassador to Naples, constructed an English garden in the gardens of Caserta, the royal palace of Naples. The English garden was basically a product of English grand tours going to Italy and trying to re-import or trying to reconstruct Arcadia in England. And here we have the trope of the English garden returned to its site of origin, to Italy. To demonstrate the conundrum of this double take, the English garden has in the background and a smoking Vesuvius. The sublime is to do with terror. And in the foreground where there should be sheep, there are mobile telephones, telefonini for the Italians, a flock of telefonini. So these are intensely coded pictures, and maybe art historians need to work on them a bit to get the references out. I don't like to give an explanation like this for everything, because it's far too explicit. This is after an English or painting in, I think it's in Chatsworth, by Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann was in Florence in 1860-ish. This is a dinner in the house of Thomas Patch, who was the English agent in Florence. His house was an open house for all English grand tourists. So these are English gents imbibing in Florence in a sort of classical space. Here the famous Tischbein picture of Goethe, with Goethe removed. It's the Campanile after Goethe. Did Goethe leave a hole in the Campanile? This one is called Google Italy headquarters. And if Google films from above, then perhaps their building would be a collision of real landscape and digital landscapes. This one, maybe we should end on this one. This is one of my favorites. It is a painting of Russian Sputnik and the constructivist Proun from Litsitsky. It's called Sputnik and Proun Frolic in Space. They're joined by Zaha's lozenge-shaped coffin. Zaha was buried in a coffin like this. And Zaha's main reference was always constructivism. So in my imagination, Zaha's up there with Sputnik and Proun. It's a mixture of cultural reference, technology, and actual experience. I was at the AA almost the same generation as Zaha. I taught in Rem and Ilya's unit when she was a student. So these are basically my list of cultural references. Okay, can we stop there, or do you want to ask a question?
Could we ask some questions, Peter? It was fantastic. Wonderful. I mean, perhaps I could begin just by asking about that AA experience. And I have this book here. I don't know if you can see the James Gowan edited Architectural Association Projects one from 46 to 71, which I think is just a couple of years before you started at the AA. But it's very clear from that there was this extraordinary drawing culture that was present in that school. And a lot of architecture schools, a certain consensus arises about what a drawing style might be for a school. I guess the Cambridge School in the 80s is maybe an example that I'm familiar with. But it seems that the AA, the period you were at, there was an incredible influence towards finding an individual language. There's a great kind of range of graphic kind of techniques kind of in evidence from the architects of your generation who were at the AA.
I think so. I think 1971 was the year I arrived in England. It was also the year Alvin Boyarsky took over being chairman of the AA. And Alvin was absolutely critical to everything that happened there. And he chose the teachers and he basically coached us all. But when you mentioned the Cambridge School, and this touches a nerve with me, because Dalabor's style in Cambridge, I somehow feel a little bit appropriated there. And the pencil shading drawings that I was doing at the AA, and I quickly gave up drawing like that. There aren't any of those here in this exhibition. When Moysen and Delabor took over my pencil shading chiaroscuro style as their unit style. So there was sort of cross-fertilization there at the AA at the time.
And were you looking intently at your contemporaries, the way that they were drawing? I mean, they were extraordinary. We've had Paul Sheppard in the program.
I taught a unit together with Paul Sheppard for 1 or 2 years. We used to have something called the Architecture Club, where we met together to discuss things. Paul Sheppard and Will also convened it. Their mentors, Cedric and James Gowan, were also there, sort of looking over our shoulder, and each of us would do a small presentation. I mean, it was very intimate discourse, and I think I was very, very lucky to arrive just at that moment. And to be amongst that group of people.
Were you looking at artists as well, or was this a very internalized conversation?
We were obviously looking at artists, and we were aware of the art world. Bernard Schumi was introducing performance art because his then girlfriend, Rosalie Goldberg, was doing exhibitions at the Royal College. And my own work was very much influenced by Tony Vidler, who was part of Ilya and Rem's unit where I was an assistant. And Tony at that time was talking about Ledoux and Boulez. So obviously my heavily shaded drawings came from that side.
I remember hearing Peter Cook say that for all the great range of tendencies that were in evidence in the AA in the 70s, perhaps what united everybody was an opposition to postmodernism.
Exactly, yeah. I think at the AA we never took postmodernism seriously. Charles Jenks was there teaching the history course, but we never went to his lectures. And we always considered it a joke. So basically, I think the impetus was similar to postmodernism. It was that we saw the need for reinventing the language of architecture, but not to import this Mickey Mouse postmodernism from America.
But you were already, I mean, it's clear from what you've just shown us that you have a profound interest and knowledge of the history of architecture. And that was, you'd come from Australia in the early 70s, so Europe was a fresh landscape for you. Were you looking at, were you traveling a lot in that period as well, or were you tied to your desk?
We were not very serious academics of seriously researching things, but basically being at the AA, one was exposed to all this stuff. There was, every night of the week, there was a lecture by really, really good people. Like Francis Yates would be there talking about the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And next night it would be Daniel Bonan or someone talking about conceptual art. So basically one had this sort of background of it was what Elvin used to call a rich diet. Basically there was lots going on, and one could pick and choose what one chose as references.
But I guess one thing that perhaps wasn't going on was building, that nobody was...
Absolutely not. No, in the 1970s there was an oil crisis, and so exactly the year I graduated, the oil crisis hit, and there were no jobs in offices. So and one was very lucky to be able to go back and be a teaching assistant at the AA. I mean, I basically consider my teaching at the AA as being an extended postgraduate time.
And so do you think that the energy you invested in, or throughout the school that was invested in drawing, was a reflection of the inability to build?
Possibly, but building was a very, it was a sort of word that one didn't like to mention because we were all aware that we were somehow handicapped and we're not doing something architects usually do. But basically the drawing was an end product at the time. I think people like Libeskind, and the drawing was only ever intended to be, or was always intended to be, the final result.
And I think you described the drawings as a way of, something to the effect that the drawings were a place where you could kind of rehearse an architecture. But there seemed to me also the drawings you were showing that they were offering a way of looking at the city. That there was the graphic conventions that you'd established provided a sort of lens through which you could rediscover the city with fresh eyes.
I think so, yeah. I think the city, and the city for us was London. I think London is a very particular city as well. You cannot understand it if you use the tropes of an Italian city. But we were also going to Italy a lot, and Italy was a big reference. And for us in particular, Architectura Radicale was a major reference, and we were always going to visit Super Studio and Archizoom in Italy because they were basically working outside the box.
And were you expecting to build, Peter? I mean, I guess Super Studio or Archizoom perhaps never were, but I mean, what were your expectations?
No, absolutely not. No, I was really chuffed when our AA diploma was published on the cover of Casabella. And basically there we were playing on the same playing field as our heroes. But the building came later. I think it's just sort of crept up on one. And I was very lucky to be one of the few people teaching at the AA who had built a house in London. We did the Blackburn House in Hampstead. But all of us were experimenting on our own living environments, like Nigel Coates or Zaha as well. So, and basically, I think the domestic environment was a major reference. And that came from Italy. The new domestic interior was a big exhibition at the MoMA put on by the Radicals.
And were you making drawings with a view to exhibition and publication, kind of from the beginning? I mean,
not really, no. And there was always a big problem with reproduction because we had to have them photographed, and framing was almost beyond our financial means. So, and occasionally Alvin would give us an exhibition, and then the AA would pay for the frames, but the exhibition wasn't the goal. I think the exhibition was simply a format for circulating ideas and engaging in discourse.
I mean, I covered the what I don't have a copy of Western Objects, Eastern Fields. One of the
If you did, you would be a wealthy person. They sell for £2,500 on eBay.
but exactly so. But obviously, famously, I think one of the publications which almost brought the AA to bankruptcy in the 80s. With I thought Alvin's publishing endeavours were.
I think it was Alvin's last book, but I'm not aware that it created financial problems.
I'd understood that his publishing wasn't the most remunerative operation going on.
And it wasn't considered as a commercial enterprise. It was basically Alvin's hobby. I mean, Alvin had a huge library, and his goal was to make books that he would like to have in his library.
It's a very beautiful book, and the experience in so the Blackburn House happens first, and then this gets seen in Japan, or how does the Japanese?
The Blackburn House happened, and at the same time, Alvin had contact with Toyo Ito, who invited the AA to do a workshop in Japan. And Alvin chose myself and Nigel Coates to do that workshop. So we suddenly found ourselves in Tokyo, teaching alongside Toyo Ito, which was quite extraordinary. And then that workshop was organized by Akira Suzuki from the Workshop of Architecture and Urbanism. And Akira shortly after asked us to design his own private house in Tokyo. I think because he didn't want to employ any Japanese architects because the others would be very jealous.
Yeah. And I guess that there were figures, I mean, a figure like Gordon Benson was teaching, I think, at the AA in that period. And I think he's been very explicit about the debt that that Benson Forsyth's work owes to you were making in that time.
Yeah, Gordon came into the AA from a side which was totally foreign to all of us. I mean, this sort of the housing side, and was basically a Richard Meyer fan. I think one can see in Gordon's work lots of influence from the people around him. And I think his Edinburgh Museum is a collage of all the people he was looking at and exposed to.
And I guess Peter Salter was another figure in that orbit.
Yeah, Peter was my technical tutor for a while in the diploma school. But there were all sorts of overlaps and different relationships. I mean, I had Peter Rice as my technical tutor once in the diploma school. So and there were collaborations which one absolutely wouldn't expect. But Peter Salter and Chris MacDonald were really important because they were the ones who really invented a whole other language of drawing.
Mm-hmm. And could you say a little about, I mean, Münster obviously is the big break for the practice, so this opportunity to build a first kind of major building. But that was, so had the Japanese experience had encouraged you to believe that there was the opportunity that this architecture, speculative architecture you've been making, actually had the opportunity, there was the possibility of it being realized at some scale?
I think then there was somewhere a phase change between the speculative or the drawing being the product and the tectonics of making becoming the subject. And that happened with the Blackburn House. It happened with the bridge in Venice as well. This is highly tectonic. But I think what happened was with making the house in Tokyo, the Blackburn House, and the folly we built in Tokyo, that we realized that to make objects which are complex constructions is a whole other skill set which we didn't actually have and needed to learn. And also the things when built actually engage the audience in a whole other way to drawings. I think from the Münster Library, our most profound experience or our most profound lesson from the Münster Library was watching people use it, because at the AA we used to write the narrative, how you're meant to experience the building, and that came from the architect. But watching the Münster Library, we noticed that people wandering around the library sort of made up their own rituals of use and their own interpretations of spaces.
And does the latter few walls that you were showing, Peter, you almost were suggesting that there was a disconnect between this work and the work that goes on in the office. Is that
Absolutely. Yeah, and those things are done outside the office. I mean, that's my private what is it? Thought trajectory. And they influence the office as well, because and we try in the office not to forget our past, but and the production of buildings doesn't really have time for cultural discourse.
But are there kind of graphic or formal conventions that appear in the artworks that you found have crept into the architecture? Or
I'm sure there are, but I would have to take a very good cultural theorist to extract them, or to find those roots.
And of course, you've also been teaching has continued to be this major part of your life, Peter. Kind of subsequent to the AA, kind of at Mendrisio, I know, for a long period.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking when you were talking about the wall as the images on behind you as being a sort of encyclopedia of your references. It's almost analogous to the way that Valerio Olgiati would talk about images. I know he's someone you've written about as a friend.
Yeah. I'm a bit uncomfortable being compared to Valerio.
He wouldn't be so comfortable.
Yeah, and he wouldn't like it either.
Let's move
Valerio
on.
considers Valerio incomparable.
But in terms of your teaching practice, is the work that we're seeing here? Are there connections there? Are you asking students to develop a kind of graphic language that's personal still?
I would do that if I did more teaching, but I think my teaching method was enormously exhausting, because I always worked on a one-to-one basis with students, and there was no system or no method one was teaching, no product preconceived, and it's this engagement with the students that takes a lot of energy out of one. So after 15 years at the AA, 3 years in Berlin and 2 years in Mendrisio, I think I was pretty much drained of energy to teach on. So my wife and partner Julia took over the teaching role. She was the dean of the school in Münster, which gave us a good platform to invite people like Valerio to Münster.